I'm really excited about today's applied problem because we're going to talk about bike safety data and analysis, which is one of my favorite topics. There's three things that we're going to cover in order to give you kind of all the background that you need to do this module. And the first is we're going to talk a bit about bike data with an emphasis on safety. We're also going to talk about exposure and how we map that and why it's important for any kind of safety analysis. And then third, we're going to talk a bit about equity because it's such an important thing to consider in a variety of analyses we do, but especially in active transportation analysis. So it's not a big surprise to most of you that in North America, cars sort of dominate our transportation system. It turns out when you look at data, car data also dominates GIS data on the transportation system. So we often find gaps in the data available to us when we're trying to make decisions or do analysis on other kinds of transportation, especially biking, walking, scootering, any kind of new transportation it tends to be limited in terms of data. One of the things that is really interesting to me is that bike safety data is one of the areas where we have really the most limited data. So there are official data sets that show where bike crashes occur, but it's estimated that only 20 to 30% of bike crashes are officially reported. So if you have a bike crash and there's no vehicle involved or the police don't get called, these often go unreported, and so it can make it really difficult for city managers or even researchers to understand what are the least safe places for bicycling. In 2014, my research group developed a website called bikemaps.org, and the goal of Bike Maps is to fill gaps in bike safety data. So anywhere in the world, you can go and map, or any bicyclist can go and map a crash, a near miss, or a hazard that they identify. And so we have seen reports worldwide. The website is available in English, Spanish, German, French, Icelandic, and Finnish. And yeah, we really encourage you to go look at it. And if you are a bicyclist or if you're someone who wants to bike, to map things that you see that are unsafe out on the road. And Bike Maps is really just a way of curating all the things that people already know. People who are out there riding already know about what's unsafe for them when they bike. When you'll feel a bit like you're on Google Maps and you pan around until you find the location where your bike incident or your observation occurred. And then you can drop a pin and we ask for, a number of questions about what happened when you were bicycling, who you are, how experienced you are. And all of these variables help us model what are predictors of unsafe cycling or help us guide cities in their decision making about where to invest in infrastructure. So we find once you get, 200 to 300 points mapped in your city, you can start to do some pretty interesting analysis. You can also, there's a visualization tab which shows dynamic hotspots of unsafe bicycling and gives you some charts associated with the types of reports that are occurring or the time of day or the time of week that those reports occur. We find that the most requested map out of Bike Maps is when cities reach out and ask us to identify the worst spots for bicycling. So we've worked with a number of cities who've said things like, can you find the 10 or 25 worst spots for bicycling in our city because we want to be able to make improvements that'll keep people safer. So we make hotspot maps quite often, and sometimes we take the Bike Maps data as well as any other data that we can find. And maybe from police or maybe from insurance corporations, and we put it all together and we can really annotate what is problematic for bicycling. Now, one of the things that's really hard is if you are a city planner, you might be trying to decide between two locations or even two different cities or two different towns, and you might need to make some decisions about which locations are safer and which ones are more dangerous in order to figure out how to invest in infrastructure or policies that are going to make things better for more people. So I just want to take a minute to think about exposure and how exposure matters. So exposure is sort of the measure of the number of people or the amount of risk associated with bicycling in a city. So you could have two cities, city A and city B, and you could have two bicyclists crash per day Or you could, in City B, you can have 5 bicyclists crash per day, and the population levels could be the same. And so you might say, oh, well, City B is less safe. City A is winning in this case because it's only had 2 crashes and the population is the same. The difference, though, sometimes can be how many people do you actually have biking. So regardless of the population, City A could have 6 bicyclists, whereas City B could have 20 bicyclists. And so then you start to be able to calculate crash rates. So in this case, if you had, 1 crash for every 3 bicyclists in City A, or 1 crash for every 4 bicyclists in City B, you might actually say, oh, just now that we understand how many people are out riding, City B is safer. So just think about different places that you've been. Some places you might see lots of bikes, and some places you might see almost none. And if you only look at the number of people that are injured or the number of crashes that occur, you'll get a skewed perception about how safe bicycling is. And in fact, you will often end up identifying unsafe cycling in places that are just because there's lots of bikes there. If there's 1,000 bikes, the chances of one person getting hurt are a lot higher than if you only have 10 bikes, for instance. So we find that exposure is so important for understanding bike safety. And we are doing a lot of different kinds of work to get a better handle on exposure. And so what you usually need is some measure of bike ridership. The most common way to collect bike ridership data is using counters that go out temporarily in the field. So we partner with a company called EcoCounter, and they have cameras that, they're little sensors that you attach to a pole. And when people walk by, they have a thermal sensor in them so they can count the number of people that pass. And then there's tubes that go out on the ground, and those will count the number of bikes that go by. So you can count both pedestrians and also bikes. And because there's usually 2 tubes, you can see which directions the bike is going based on which tube gets hit first. So we can get all kinds of data this way. We also can get some data from fitness apps and other kinds of innovative data sets that allow us to understand some things about how many people are biking. So we often work with Strava data as well. Strava data is generated usually from fitness riders, but we have found all kinds of interesting ways of correcting that data to make it more representative. So I think the third thing that we want to talk about is when we make decisions around bicycling, we also have to incorporate equity. And sometimes we call different kinds of environments for biking supportive and unsupportive. So a supportive biking environment would be one where you have lots of bike lanes, or you have traffic calming measures so that the bikes can feel and be safe. Whereas an unsupportive environment can be busy streets, complicated intersections, lots of lanes of traffic. The challenge with bike research is that when you have a really unsupportive environment, you tend to have fewer bikes, but the people that are biking there really have no other choice but to bike there. The worst biking environments that are the most dangerous are problematic because the only people that use them are people that have no other choice. And so, because if you had a choice, you would choose a safer route most of the time. And so when we look at, when we don't consider exposure, we can create all kinds of problems for equity, because it ends up really like the worst places for biking have almost no bikes. And so they have few crashes, but when a crash does occur, it can be really catastrophic. So incorporating exposure into your safety analysis is one really important way to make sure that you are not doing biased analysis that is going to further inequities in who has access to transportation. It's just really something important to consider as you think about this lab or think about the module that you're going to work on and the activities in this module, and consider how we can support better decision making in biking, but also I think the lessons that you'll learn here are going to apply to lots of other planning decisions that get made, particularly in urban contexts. Thanks so much.